Thanks for making it for today's webinar. And we are expecting to have today. That is a commendable attendance and participation. It's an equivalent of, and don't take that for granted. Thank you much. Thank you so much for making it. I am the head of internal audit at Umeme, Uganda Limited. And I am also the vice president at the Institute of Certified Public Accountants of Uganda. Our own president, CPA Frederick Chibedi, we are happy to have Institute of Certified Accountants in Rwanda. We are also happy to have council members online. I have seen Constant and as we proceed. Today we'll be having a conversation around internal audit and risk management. And this is an important topic for discussion because the mandate of internal audit is to enhance and organize, to enhance and advise on organizational value, management, and in these times of COVID-19 and the emergence of the disruptions we have from the weather, +12.
Hello? Yes, Ruth. Yeah. Okay, then you're coming. Good afternoon, fellow members. As Ruth tries to come back, I will stand in for her. My name is John Bosco Ntangare. I'm Director of Education at the Institute of Certified Public Accountants of Uganda. As she mentioned, this afternoon we are discussing internal audit and risk management. And we have two distinguished presenters or facilitators. One is Doreen Wakatungu Busine. She's the head of internal audit at Stanbic Bank, Uganda, and regional head East Africa. On the other side, we will have Mr. Adam Sengova. Adam is an associate director at PricewaterhouseCoopers. So they will be taking us through this afternoon. And on that note, I request CPA Doreen to lead us in the first presentation. Doreen, you are welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm hoping that you can all hear me.
Doreen, we can hear you.
Okay, that's good. Thank you very much. I'm just going to try and put my presentation on the screen so that we have some talking points. Please confirm when you can see it so that I can start.
Yes, we can see it.
All right, thank you very much. Today is a very exciting day for the internal audit profession, and I'm very honored to be speaking on this very important topic, which is quite critical during this period. And the good thing about it is that it's come at a time where we have some practical examples, we have experience about what we are talking to, and we're able to share as we go along. What I'll do is I'll go through the presentation, and I'll then allow for question and answer, which will be facilitated by CPA Doreen after the presentation. Just to start us off and give some context to the topic, I thought I would sort of give a view of the past and the present. And when we talk about the past, we all know that we mean pre-COVID-19. And I won't go through introducing what COVID-19 is, what has happened, the impact on the economy and the country, because we've had a lot of conversations around that, both through the ISPAO, and also a lot of things have been written in the news. So I'm assuming that as accountants and auditors in our profession, we're spending a lot of time basically understanding what's happening. But when we look at it from an audit perspective from our profession, one of the things that is very clear is that we have a clear past and we have a place where we need to go as a profession. So previously we had traditional audit activities where we were very clear from our methodologies, the things that we needed to do. Our mandates were very clear, and our roles and responsibility as third line, as assurance providers, like CPA Doreen mentioned, were very clear. We have also spent a lot of time as professionals, and the experience that we have has given us a good understanding of the risks in our organizations. So when you look at, say, if you're an audit team in an organization, you're an audit team in a bank, it is very clear that you now have a good understanding of your risks based on where the organization was. And a lot of our audits activities were covering historical information. But the present and the future is very different, and we all agree to that. One, we know we're in a VUCA environment. We all know, I'm assuming we know what VUCA is. And if you actually look at the things that form the environment that we're in, the impact of COVID-19 has stressed organizations in a very unprecedented way. The risk profile that we knew, I can actually ask a lot of people in their organizations if they understand these risks now and in the future fully, and I don't think we have a good view of that because this is very unprecedented. We don't know where it's going. The risk profile of our organizations has changed significantly. And we are in a situation where whatever the problem is, our organizations are trying to solve something. So we need to be part of that solution. And I think that is just a very key preamble to all the conversations that we have. And if we fail to reinvent or adapt as a profession, both you and your organizations will stall or will fail. So I think for me, that was the key, a key view into actually how we want to be talking about this as a profession. So I thought I would also start by giving a view of what a strong and valuable internal audit function looks like. And this is categorized in 4 sectors, so that as we go through the rest of the discussion, you're very clear about what value and what strong and what relevance will look like. And the things that I'll highlight is, providing guidance now. What does that mean? Your biggest contribution can simply be asking your management teams, how can I help? And help can come in very different forms. Being a trusted risk advisor, and as risk professionals, one of the things that we do is we're very well placed to be able to give insights into risk at the moment. And so in order for us to remain strong and relevant, there are things we need to do around redirecting our attention to things that are very topical right now and redirecting our risk appetite to COVID-19 priorities. And of course, in order for us to be able to do that, we need to really understand the impact of COVID-19 on our industries and our businesses. And I keep on saying, as risk professionals, we can't be the people who are focusing, understanding this through WhatsApp, through the memes that go out, but spending a lot of time reading industry information, reading about best practice that is going on in the industries that you report in and that you support, because it's very important that we understand the impact of COVID-19 on our industries and our businesses. And we should continue to monitor and update that thinking, because if we thought we knew, because remember, we've talked about the fact that this is unprecedented. So we don't know. And therefore, we have to monitor and update our thinking. There are emerging risks, and most of these are even unpredictable. So things come up that you thought you actually knew, but you don't know. So how are we spending time trying to understand? And of course, at the end of the day, which was not very, a lot of the times we get feedback as internal auditors, something that we're not very good at and not being seen as humane. How are we being flexible? The ability to respond with flexibility and creativity. We are in a fluid environment, so how do we make sure that we continue to reset our priorities? So I think for me, those are the things that I wanted to talk about as a preamble. Please confirm if you can still see the presentation.
We're still getting it.
You're still seeing it?
Yeah.
Okay.
But put in the full, the slideshow, put the slideshow.
Because something has changed as I was speaking, so I'm trying to figure out what I need to do. Just hold on. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, Doreen, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. So the next bit is just to give us a view into when we are thinking about these pandemic situations, how should we look at it? And this COVID has been around, we went into lockdown as a country, and so a lot of literature and has been documented and existed in terms of how crisis situations sort of evolve. So I'll basically flag three things. One is respond, recover is the second, and renew. And let's start with respond. So respond is what has happened to date. Basically, it's about survival and resolve phase. So when we look at the time the lockdown was coming, at the time businesses were shutting down, transport is not available. How are the businesses basically addressing their immediate challenges to their workforce, to their customers, to technology? That is the respond phase, the real crisis phase. We then move into the recover stage, which is currently what is happening now. After the directive, we know next week a lot of things are opening up. Private cars will be open, companies will start to open. And this is where you look at resilience and return phase. Basically, the companies that have survived the response stage, you're looking at being resilient, you're looking at returning back to near to, and I wouldn't even call it to business as usual, you're returning back to an operational stage. So this is where businesses are addressing, near-term challenges like, cost pressures. You're looking at how are you going to return your business to scale given where you are. Then the next phase of a crisis situation is renew, because what should happen going forward? You can't return to the situation before the crisis. And this is where we look at reimagining and reforming phase of a crisis. And most of the conversations that happen in that stage is, lessons learned from before the crisis. What does the new normal look like? I think we've had a lot of conversations around the new normal, so there's a lot of jargon around that. From a continent perspective, from an industry perspective, from a personal perspective, what is a renew stage looking like? So in terms of the conversation for internal audit, the three aspects are very relevant. And I'll look at it for the 5 things that really impact us as a profession. And that's sort of what I'll be talking to. 1 is from our people. 2 is risk. 3 is our internal audit processes. 4 in terms of how we enable our businesses. And 5 in terms of our audit committee expectations. So what did respond look like? What does recover look like? What will renew look like? Because if we are having a real conversation around the impact of COVID-19, the impact of a crisis situation, we must look at it in the 3 lanes, and we must look at it in the different aspects that are important for us as a profession. So if I look at the people lens, respond is where we are. Some of us are still in response stage. Some of us are already thinking about the recover stage. You know, all our staff are working from home. Most of our organizations, they said internal audit is not relevant. I kept on saying no, and it's not that we're not relevant, it's that we are flexible. We can move and work from another place, but we are still very relevant. But so we had a lot of staff working from home with limited exceptions in some organizations. We then had a precedent where we redirected staff to non-audit work. So we had our staff, you know, getting involved in process reviews, things that we hadn't thought before, because remember, we were in a crisis situation. And we're talking about how do we actually look at, you know, responding in a crisis. We loaned staff to other functions, you know, risk functions, people loaned staff to finance, because in a situation like this, which was unprecedented, the impact on some functions was more than the other. So you can't continue to work in isolation. And this was, you know, noting the potential individual independence issues that this may create for the future, things that we had not thought about before. Regular check-in with our teams, especially now that we're working remotely. And then for a lot of the conversations that we've had and we've seen, people repurpose their free time and make sure that they were carrying out a lot of training. Now we're moving into a recovery state. What does that mean for us? So we have to continue to lead with a human response. And I think this is said for, not just for the internal audit profession, but for basically as an economy, as a country, exposure to staff becomes the first thing at the top of the agenda. So how do we look at that for internal audit staff? So we then see a lot of function will still continue to work at home. We have to embrace an evolving culture shift towards, you know, the comfort of working from home. Auditors usually are the hardest people to change in terms of our thinking. But can you imagine working from home and actually doing an audit with and being effective? You didn't sit on the screen and tell someone, show me the evidence, but you must arrive at that comfort level. We are getting to a culture where we also have to, if we are getting ourselves comfortable to working from home, then we should also get people comfortable that they actually can execute their activities outside the office. Team productivity becomes a key conversation. I think internal audit as a profession, we were already ahead of the pack in terms of things like timesheets. We organize ourselves in project form. So we were much better at understanding how we'll measure team productivity, but this becomes critical in the recover stage. We're going to see budget cuts, reduction in the cost of our audit plans. I mean, we know that the situation that we're in is going to come with cost containment. It's a higher risk organization. There's more risk out there, but we're not going to be given more people, and there's not going to be more money spent on us to give assurance on that risk. If anything, we're going to have to see a cost in a reduction in the cost of the audit plan. So what does that mean? And then of course, burnout. I'll not elaborate on that because that's very clear. And then I'll just start on the impact from a renew stage. What do we then start to ask ourselves as we go into a renew stage? And for me, this is something that becomes very critical for every head of audit, very critical for our professional bodies that support us, very critical for you as individuals. You have to ask yourself, so how are you accelerating yourself in terms of getting future ready skills? Remember when we went into response mode, people were moved into other audits work. You know, you were being loaned to other functions. You can't say, I audit only branches because your branches were closed. We were forced to get into a situation where we had to work remotely. So conversations around data that we'll be talking about became critical. So it's now a time for us to accelerate our future, getting ready for our future ready skills. And so this is not something, a 2-year strategy, it is a now, and it's in the renew stage. So how are you thinking about that in your teams and in your organizations? Reimagining work as a thing we do, not a place we go to. I always ask people, what do you do? Say, I work for Stanbic. No, you're an internal auditor in Stanbic. Yes, that's where you go. You might be going to the organization, but what you do is, you know, if someone asks you, it shouldn't be, I am an internal auditor for Stanbic, but you should be able to say what you do for Stanbic, not the place, what you do for the organization. What is your role? What is the value that you add? And that is going to be the key conversation in terms of the renew stage, and not where we do the work, but what we do. Mature performance management, outcome-based. You're not going to be able to see your audit team sitting around you going and doing a walkthrough. It's the outcome of the work that is going to be the new way that we actually assess performance. Leadership required for managing remote working teams. I can imagine the anxiety most of the leaders had when you can't see your people, you don't know what they're doing, you're worried, you know your good performers, you know your people that you're worried about. And that is just the new world, that's a new scale, because you're not going to know going forward. So how do we recalibrate the leaders to adapt to this? And then corporate presence while working remotely. One of the things that was quite key for audit was during this time, we were working at home for most of the time, but we were trying to remain relevant and impactful. So corporate presence as you work remotely is going to be a key conversation, and how you, and a thing that you need to ask yourselves as you go into the renew stage. I just want to touch briefly on the risk lens, because this is also a critical aspect of what we do. So from a risk lens, again, in the category of respond, recover, and renew. As part of respond, when the lockdown came, people are running around, the business owners are dealing with a crisis. They don't have time for audits. They don't understand how you can start to have a conversation around an audit that you set on the plan last year in October. So this is what happened in the response stage. We focused on the truly greatest risks. That is what I'm assuming, and I'm hoping that we all did. Looking for change in controls or control overrides. And during this crisis, we've seen some of the things that have become more prevalent in terms of risk. You know, your cyber risk, the hackers are getting more innovative, information risk, you're working from home, people have access to systems, people have access to data, the effectiveness of the business continuity plans, fraud and conduct. Fraud and conduct becomes quite topical risk because one, the nature of the world that we are in, people are under pressure. But two, because of the crisis mode, then processes were moved from their usual places to other places, and the exposure starts to happen from how transactions are being approved and things like that. Credit risk, that was quite topical, especially in the banking industry. We all know what's happening in the economy, and so this becomes top of the radar. And during this crisis, as part of Respond, our audits then focus truly on the greatest risk, and compliance caused all these regulations. But the advisory angle is one that became quite topical, and I know that the CPA team asked that I speak about this a bit more. So during this time, you can't be, if you look at our audits, we usually report the problem. And during this time was not the time to report the problem. It was more to ensure that the plans are adequate. We were part of the problem solving. We all know that some organizations did spend enough time and attention to BCP because it looked quite ambiguous. But now was not the time to stand up and start saying, you know, we've been telling you your BCPs were not adequate. I mean, not the time for regrets. We're in a crisis mode. Constructive collaboration discussions around the BCPs. How are we identifying practical solutions? How are we helping? And that was our role during this period, even with a risk management lens. So a lot of advisory work is work that we should be doing and we should have been doing. Assessing the organization's crisis management and business continuity plans, things like looking at new emerging risks in the operating models where people are working from home. How are you providing input, real-time input in, say, you know, the provisioning of systems that are working remotely? Have the right controls been put in place to manage cyber risk, for example? Changes in policy. People started changing processes and policies. So you cannot say, oh, I've identified that a process has changed, I will put it in my audit plan for Q3. No, you need to talk about it now. You need to give input now if that process that they're changing makes sense and will be able to manage the risk that they're looking at. And that's where the advisory hat comes in. Laws and regulations were coming in. You know, central bank was issuing regulations for us in the industry. How do we help interpret the regulation? Not wait for management to interpret the regulation and come 3 months later to tell them they actually interpreted it wrong and did it wrong. There is no time for that. That is not what we should be doing as internal audit now. And then emerging risk assessments and things like that. So advisory becomes a very key component of what we need to look at as from a response perspective, but it also moves into the recover. So you need to continue to see things that, you know, as we're moving into a digital environment, how are we thinking about the potential risks that come from that? We know, for example, and I keep using the banking industry because it's one that is, you know, I'm very familiar with and very close to. We're moving into much less use of the branches to enable transactions and more into the digital platforms. And that significantly changes the risk profile of our organizations. So what does that mean in terms of the potential risks? How have we refocused ourselves as internal audit to understand those risks that come with the digital environment, and not continue to have our audit plans talking about, going to Arua to see how they're counting cash. Cash no longer becomes an important conversation in a bank. So prioritization of control design, because a lot of the time, most of our organizations have changed their processes and controls. So the work that we are doing now, what of us, the discussions that are happening is, you can actually split your work between, you do the control design as phase one, and then you test the operating effectiveness of that, of those processes and controls as phase two. But the assurance that you provide on the control design needs to be quick and give the feedback, because remember, we're in a crisis situation and management needs to get this feedback real time. So how do we repurpose ourselves to do that? And then from an anticipate perspective, we're moving into a stage where we have to be looking at risks that are not known now. We must be doing our, scanning of the environment. If that expectation is going to come from us, start thinking about the next crisis. Start thinking about, from a COVID perspective, we've been reading and we know that they're talking about that this might not be the end of it. We are in recover stage, but we might be going back to a response stage, because the crisis might take different shapes. It might be, I think you've heard of a W, it recover stage, but the number of cases go up again. So we might actually have another directive coming through and they're putting us back into lockdown. But how are we scanning the environment and advising management as we go along, if that is to happen? How are we actually also looking at, the governance framework and the decision-making to enable those conversations? So a lot of work and a lot of changes in the way we look at things. Quickly, just on the process side, less assurance, more consulting. I'll not talk about that because it's quite clear that that is actually how we're thinking about audit as a function now. Scope refinements. If you were in the middle of an audit, it was a time when you actually put your pens down and started to think, should I continue? Is the scope still relevant? Should I change it? Should I now bring in an aspect of the transactions that are being processed as part of COVID? Do I report it in the same way? A lot of questions were asked and we were in the middle of audits, remember. Suspended audit plans to focus on, to allow business to deal with the urgent disruptions. Data analysis capability, we are working from home. Social distancing, we're working remotely. You cannot do your walkthrough by saying, give me the evidence and looking at the person and asking them to explain. Doing it remotely. Travel was put on hold. A lot of us do our audits by going up country, getting support even internationally, but that was not possible. And yet we are still expected to provide assurance. So from a process perspective, things like as part of recover, our audit methodologies and systems need to look at this. If your audit methodology was purely assurance, purely audit, how are you thinking about changing your audit methodology to look at consulting reviews, to look at real-time assurance, to look at an audit report that doesn't come from planning, I don't know, different stages, I issue a notification. I think some of the examples we had was during the period, if you're going to issue a notification, imagine your stakeholders are in the middle of a crisis and you're issuing a note to say, by the way, I'm coming to audit your branches. So even that part of the methodology sounded very inhumane, like you didn't understand the situation they're going through. So we need to look at our audit methodologies. How quickly do we get our reports out? How can they be thin, direct, quick reports? Might be PowerPoint presentations. Data analysis capability. How are we looking at that from a recover stage? And then things like, open audit actions. A lot of conversations around, we had audits that we've done, audit actions hadn't been closed, but we are still maintaining the same due date. We're still maintaining the amount of pressure. Have we gone back to ask ourselves and the stakeholders, do you still actually feel that you are on track? Do you need more time? Is it still relevant? Does the risk still make sense? A lot of things that we can actually do in the recover stage. But from a renew perspective, from an internal audit process perspective, the 4 things that for me became quite important to talk about was how we have an agile and responsive audit planning process. Meaning that we must be able to drop add, refine our scopes real time, because we saw that was what was required in Respond. So your practice cannot be, I'll be doing an annual audit plan. Even a quarterly refresh of the audit plan might not be applicable. It might actually be monthly. That means you need to get yourselves, your stakeholders, your board comfortable that you are going to keep re-looking at the audit plan and making it relevant. So annual planning might not be, it's not agile anymore. So how are we looking at that in the renew stage as an audit profession? How are we looking at accelerating the use of data analytics, data science, robotics? Because here we will be able to work remotely, we'll increase our coverage, and we'll be able to actually do the work without disrupting business. With the robotics, we already started doing robotics in internal auditing in Stanbic. You actually have access to the system. You write your scripts, you know what you need to do. The only time the stakeholder sees you is when you have the report. So all this around, you know, we need to give them time, leave us alone, come, you're only coming with a report. You can imagine what that looks like for us. So accelerating this journey is very, very critical for us. And we need to start talking about that. Data science, predictive analysis, we've talked about that as a profession in a renew stage. That is now and not later. Lessons learned and team structures. I thought I'd also talk about team structures because most of us structure ourselves, IT auditors, you know, someone doing branch audits, this one does this business unit. But we saw that, you know, the impact of a crisis means that there are different hotspots and you have to move your people where the hotspot is. So you can imagine if you are responsible for an area where the hotspot was not happening, were you going to sit home and become irrelevant? Or did it mean that we need to actually have structures in internal audit that all our auditors are universal auditors? You can repurpose, you can actually go and do a cyber audit, even if you're a business auditor, because that is what the new internal audit profession looks like. From our enabling business lens, just some examples of how internal audits can enable business, you know, attending crisis management meetings, the committees, highlighting emerging risks, you know, help identify mitigation strategies. We usually want to look at the side, identify, and I tell you if it's right or wrong. But now here we're supposed to be helping. Objective voice, we are the voice of reason. Combined assurance, big conversation. How are we working with risk and the other assurance providers? Because the risks that are there now, there's not one function that can actually look at this in totality on their own. Real-time assurance, I talked about that. Being part of the emergency response teams. If you look at the conversations around that, is if we are a profession that is saying that we want to have an understanding of the risks that are happening in the business now, if you're not part of the crisis management meeting, if you're not part of the emergency response teams, you will not have an idea of the risks that are impacting your business, because that is where the discussions are happening. That is where the risks that are impacting your businesses are. That is where the decisions that are impacting the businesses are. And so it becomes very important that we actually are part of these conversations and we are spending time understanding those risks. So don't be too independent from this crisis that is happening by not being part of those conversations. And that's the new us. And that means we need to make sure we have a seat at the table on that. Expectations from the audit committee, quite clear. From a response perspective, the ability to successfully identify emerging risks, our board members expected that and our shareholders. Regular communication, it's not about a quarterly meeting. Informal conversations, we had a lot of changes to the plan that we talked about and processes. How are we engaging with our audit committee chairs? And this was happening in virtual meetings. So you can't only access your audit committees once a quarter, you need to be looking for them more regularly because you need the support and buy-in with all the changes that are happening. But in the recover stage, we also then need to make sure that we've accounted for all the impact of this in our reporting. So how are you positioning your audit committee reports? A clear section on how you've dealt with this. Your audit committee report in February cannot look the same as the audit committee report that you have now in May. There's a lot that has happened. There's a lot of impact that you need to position. But from a future perspective, remember audit committee members will have the benefit of hindsight. So they're going to hold us accountable. We can't go and sit home and say, we were called irrelevant, we were told we don't have access. So we're waiting for when this crisis ends to come back because they're going to ask us how we achieved our coverage. So that is actually what the renew stage is looking like. So respond now cannot be we actually reduced the work. We didn't ask the questions and we didn't cover these key risks. Because in renew stage, our audit committee members have the benefit of hindsight. They're going to actually ask the question on how we looked at these risks. And then we need to continue to provide that assurance to our audit committees. So what have we learned from COVID-19 so far? Just a summary to close off my discussion. COVID-19 as an epidemic is exactly what risk management is all about. It was all about uncertainty, emerging risks, unpredictable things. You know, when you'd have a conversation and say, this is an issue because this might happen. The fights we used to have were about, I only want to accept the issue when it has happened, when I have an issue. But this has shown that we actually need to plan for the unforeseen. And so this crisis is what risk management is all about. How do we make sure that post-COVID work environment will look very different from today? This is going to impact our people, risk processes, the way we engage our businesses and our audit committees. So it is very clear that the 3 stages are going to impact those areas. Being an effective and a trusted partner means that we have to know and understand and anticipate risks and see the risk landscape fully. Assurance, advisory, anticipating, that should actually be our new motto. It's not about we are assurance providers. If I could ask the Institute of Internal Audit to look at that. We are going to have to be advisors. We are going to have to be people who anticipate emerging risks. Work is not a place you go to, but rather what you do. And the humane approach is very important. A lot of the things we've talked about are actually how we as a function are coming out as human to our people and to our stakeholders. And so all this will make sure that we understand whether we are stronger or more valuable internal audit profession. So that's it from me. And I just wanted to leave you with a parting shot. It's only in our darkest hours that we may discover the true strength of the brilliant light within ourselves that can never, ever be dimmed. So this is the time for us to actually discover our strength as a profession, because that light cannot be dimmed. So thank you very much for listening to me, and stay safe, and I'll be taking questions later.
Thank you so much, Doreen. Let's have the questions coming through the question and answer board. We will now hear from CPA Adam Sengova.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to you all. Very pleased to be here with you this afternoon as we discuss the sort of impacts COVID has brought to our world. Myself, I'm an associate director of PricewaterhouseCoopers. I've worked in the banking industry before, both in risk management and internal audit, so I understand quite a bit of challenges that you have, and I've previously worked at Deloitte & Touche under the risk advisory practice. So today I'll be sharing with you some insights just around, okay, as internal auditors, as risk managers, what should we be focused on? I'll be sharing my screen shortly so that we go through just a couple of slides. As I do that, just confirm to me that you can see the screen on your side.
Yes, we can see it.
Yes.
Okay. So as I was saying, I'll be sharing with you quite a number of insights in terms of what should we be doing and what should we be focusing on. And if I may just start just by giving you an overview, this presentation looks at the background in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic and what sort of effects it has had on businesses and the rationale for internal audits involvement. We then look into the 6 core issues. We did perform a global survey where we surveyed CFOs and CEOs. And the question was, what's really keeping them awake at night during this COVID pandemic? So this was subscribed to by over 2,000 CEOs globally, and I'll be able to share some of the core issues. And I think these will then form the basis of ourselves asking the question of how have we supported the business in the response stage in terms of hovering over these key issues in terms of what the CEOs and CFOs are saying. And then how do we then go ahead to amplify our contribution to this sort of pandemic and this sort of crisis and helping the business be able to deal with the new normal? That's what we'll cover under the 3rd element of this presentation. Then I'll be able to share some of the resources and the people you can contact to get quite a bit of more information, yeah? So in terms of the background, the COVID-19 situation, of course, has presented some substantial challenges for businesses and governments, and of course, communities at the end of the day. We're likely to see quite a bit of a bigger impact across bigger businesses. And I think quite a bit of us have seen all these sort of like communications coming through about people being laid off, about businesses going under receivership. And you know, it's really hitting home. And how does it hit home? It's affecting employees, it's affecting customers, it's affecting suppliers who are relying on certain businesses for their operations. So as internal auditors, we need to always be able to demonstrate that sort of agility and respond accordingly in as regards supporting our business hover around these sort of challenges. So what does this mean from an internal audit perspective? We have an important role to play in ensuring that organizations can maintain the strong system of internal control during this period of change and uncertainty. Of course, I think Doreen alluded to this. Quite a number of us have plans for FY20. You know, when in the traditional way of doing things, we felt we understood the business, we had all these brilliant plans that were then approved by the Audit Committee. But all that has since changed because that happened when it was business as usual. It's business unusual today. So the changes to the working practices and organizational arrangements in response to this COVID-19 have effectively introduced a new range of enhanced risks and that have the potential of substantially disrupting the existing system of internal controls, or that have the potential of actually making your business totally irrelevant. So we, as internal auditors right now, is a chance we have because, well, these are challenging times. We've always spoken to management and said, we're agile, we add value. I think those are some of the connotations I normally hear from internal auditors, and we've spoken about it for a long time. But businesses need us now more than ever, yeah? And this is more or less like an opportunity for us as internal auditors to really bring forward the value, the sort of insights we have from a risk management perspective, from a macro perspective, because we sit at the top. We know what's working where and what sort of operations are probably at risk. So we engage management on a day-to-day, and this is sort of the opportunity we need to be able to take this discussion sort of forward. So as we move on, like I said, what are we hearing from business leaders across the world in as regards what's really keeping them awake at night? At the peak of the pandemic in Europe and the greater Asia, this is when we sent out a survey to both CFOs and business leaders across the world. And at the time, March 11th, 2020, 54% were of the view that the COVID pandemic would have a significant impact on businesses and operations. And as such, it would go ahead to cause a great concern to their business operations. As we speak, as of end of last week, 87% have actually accepted that the pandemic has actually gone ahead to have a significant impact on their operations. But what has really kept them awake at night? You've heard Doreen talking about the response phase. You know, we had all these beautiful BCPs, we had all these beautiful disaster recovery plans, but you see, you know, I remember, I think 30th March, President announced a total lockdown, you know, so what do? How do you move forward? You probably don't have your BCP with you, so you can't even look at it and read. So those are some of the things that actually kept CEOs and CFOs awake that very day in Uganda. Workforce, you know, we've seen issues with job security, we've seen issues with inability to work remotely, and as such, creates all sorts of anxieties around whether people still have jobs, whether people will still be relevant, because in this entire lockdown, there are people who have never been contacted ever since their business is closed, and they hear probably some other people are going to work and stuff. So it creates that sort of fear and anxiety that's not desired. Supply chain and operations, you know, we all rely on third parties to be able to do our business. And as such, with all the lockdowns, with all the shutdowns of airports, borders and stuff, of course, that caused some sort of delays in our operations. And as such, business leaders were really concerned in as regards how their businesses would be able to get through this particular time of period. Finance and liquidity. We've seen quite a number of businesses focusing on hoarding cash, deferring capital expenditures, and really focusing on only expenditures that are business critical. Of course, from a banking perspective, we've seen the likes of the central bank asking banks to hold payments of dividends and repatriation of the same, so that, you know, at the end of the day, banks have enough capital available to deal with the sort of credit risks Doreen has been talking about, but also to deal with the redundancies. I'm sure not everyone is working within banks or even all these other organizations. Then, of course, tax and regulation. You know, ever since the COVID pandemic started, you know, it's been changes in regulation day after day. So how do you keep up with that? How do you engage your regulators? How do you engage the taxman to make sure at the end of the day you're compliant? Because if you're not compliant, you know, you won't be in business. But then again, all these changes on a day-to-day, you know, have an effect on your strategy, and they have an effect on your reputation and brand in the market. So these are some of the 6 core issues globally, even within East Africa and Uganda, that kept CEOs and CFOs awake at night in terms of how do they deal with all these things. So when you reflect as an internal auditor, how have you helped the business address these challenges? How does your plan, or how does your activities, or how do your activities currently reflect vis-a-vis some of the core issues we're looking at right now? So going forward, out of the Navigator survey, we also surveyed up over 2,000 chief audit executives who had the chance of sharing what things they're probably doing within the COVID pandemic. And as such, as PwC, we've more or less zeroed down these into 4 key areas. The first one was already alluded to by Doreen. As internal auditors, how do we amplify the contribution in terms of our response? We need to redirect our risk expertise to the COVID-19 priorities of the business. And we'll see the details of this in the forthcoming slides. We need to identify new delivery models and non-traditional ways to help add value. And why do we say non-traditional? I think there's a change in mindset that is required. You know, the business of, you know, the manual reports, the business of not failing to use technology, the business of failing to trust. And I think Doreen alluded to this at some point in time, whereby you know your team very well. You're thinking, okay, these are my high flyers. These guys, I have to check on them 24/7 and stuff. And probably if they're not in the office, then that means they're not working. So we need to let go of the traditional ways of managing people. You know, we're dealing with, I think it's now the Generation Z, you know, who don't have any sort of loyalty when it comes to hanging on to jobs and stuff. So if, you know, you're really breathing down their neck and asking about what sort of things they're doing and why they're not in office and stuff, that's the traditional being things. We need to change the mindset to result and result-oriented sort of management, yeah? Proactively, of course, communicating to all stakeholders. So how do we know our stakeholders as internal audit? How well do we know them? How well do we understand their needs? How well do we make sure that during this COVID pandemic, we're actually responding to the needs of all our stakeholders? Then lastly, of course, how do we redirect any short-term excess capacity to support the business in the short and medium term? And I think also, how do we then also utilize this excess capacity in developing the department in the long term? And we'll look at some of the examples when I get to that slide, yeah? So coming back to redirecting the risk expertise to COVID priorities, how do we connect with, or how do we connect into the COVID response team and help align their efforts? And by connection, before we even say, and this I'll allude to the response phase, before we even say that we're going to connect to the crisis response teams and stuff, have we actually performed a self-assessment of our teams? Do we know their skills? Do we know their experience? Do we know their capabilities? And as such, when you go to ask management, how do we help? And probably management says, these are the areas we're facing challenges with. Are you able to deploy there and then? Do you have the information about your team to know that these are the sort of capabilities you have? Or if you look at it from the other point of view, the question we probably should be posing to management, or we should be advising management that, okay, these are the capabilities we have, and having thought through the sorts of challenges, looking at, okay, business as usual and business the way we are now, we think these are the key pain points and this is how we can help, as opposed to asking the question of how do we help? So how are we proactive in thinking through what sort of issues management is going to have to deal with? What sort of issues the CFO is going to have to deal with? What sort of issues the human capital team is dealing with, or the guys in customer service? And then using our skills and capabilities as internal audit, how can we plug into that and help them down the road? We spoke of, then of course, the key leadership qualities as we connect with these teams. Soft skills of empathy and listening. You know, we need to listen to what the issues are, because this just happened, you know, no one planned for it, no one foresaw it coming. You know, woke up one day and there's a lockdown and it's being extended and all that kind of stuff. So how are we listening to what sort of challenges the business is facing? And we need to be able to empathize, because, you know, we're working with these guys. They probably have families. They probably have people that have suffered in as regards to this particular pandemic. So we need to have that sort of empathy, but we also need to be flexible, you know, as opposed to, you know, going in to crack the whip. So I thought at that point in time, we need to be able to articulate what sort of role we're going to play. Because the moment that people see auditors, they know it's going to be a review, there's going to be a report. But probably that's not the case right now. Probably the case right now is for us to understand where the business is, understand the change in the risk landscape, and be able to more or less advise management and give them some comfort around the sorts of strategies or the sorts of direction they want to take the business through. So one of those things we can do is, you know, we had a process flow map or a risk and control self-assessment done when it was still business as usual. Of course, when you activate the BCP, then there are certain processes that are going to be left out. There are certain automated processes or manual processes that will be left out. So those, of course, also feed into certain risks in as regards failure of controls, or they expose the organization to certain risks from a fraud risk perspective. And this also Doreen alluded to. So how have we identified the business as usual sort of process flow maps? And have we come up with process flow maps for the business as of now? And as such, also identified what sort of risks are coming out of that, and how are we reporting to the crisis management team in terms of the key things they ought to monitor as they push the business going forward. Then, of course, focus on the key emerging risks. We've talked about cybersecurity very well. We've talked about fraud and regulation. And then how are we capturing the lessons learned? Because guys, we did have the BCPs, we did have the DRPs, but probably what's in the BCPs and DRPs is actually not working now. But are we taking stock of what's not working, so that when we're back to the renew phase, or when we're back to a real semblance of the old normal, or probably a stable phase, we can then reflect on the certain things we need to change within these plans. Then, you know, everyone is up in arms. You know, next week we're going back to work and all that kind of stuff. Have we thought about the sort of like regulations from a Ministry of Health perspective around social distancing? For instance, you could have a business, and as such, you need to house, say, 200 employees. But when you apply those social distancing rules and procedures, you probably might end up with 80 or 100 people within the office, yeah? So have we thought about how the business is going to be run when we return to work next week? How have we communicated to staff and explained to them who is actually required in the office and who can continue working offsite? Have we helped manage their mindsets in as regards the anxiety and stuff? So what are we bringing to this team, as opposed to just sitting there and demanding for our presence? So of course, we've talked about revisiting your approach and conducting the FY20 audits and advisory reviews to focus on what is business critical today. You'd have really shelved whatever plans you have and more or less embarked on redoing a risk assessment as of now, and you know what, more or less engaging your audit committees, the management team, and probably other stakeholders like regulators to refocus your efforts as internal audit, and also consider the impact on FY21, because are you going to continue business as usual when it's a new normal? So are you thinking about what sort of things are going to have to appear in your FY21 internal audit planning? We've covered the capturing of lessons learned. So we also did a survey with your colleagues in terms of the chief audit executives across the world. And these are some of their responses in terms of how they've redirected the risk expertise. I think most of them have reprioritized internal audit activities and have updated their risk assessment in terms of evaluating the emerging risks. And as such, of course, that then informs their approach in terms of what resources are they going to deploy where. Of course, some of them have also participated in the company's COVID-19 response team in terms of giving assurance on what sort of actions are being taken there. Others are working with regulators to understand and even influence and respond to expectations. So this is also from a side of stakeholder management. For the likes of banks, you'll have Bank of Uganda, you'll have the NSSF, you'll have the URA, of course. But of course, all these guys have different sort of deadlines and penalties that come across when these deadlines are not met. So how is internal audit actually helping in terms of reviewing the quality and engaging those regulators also on behalf of the business? Then, of course, we also saw that some of the internal audit teams are supporting the first and second lines of defense. And this also came through when Doreen talked about you really sitting in with the risk team as we speak to see how they're going about the risk and control self-assessment updating, and as such, how they are really understanding and evaluating the sort of risks that the business is being exposed to as we speak. So these are some of the options your colleagues globally have taken in terms of redirecting the risk expertise, yeah? So going on to the second area of focus, we've talked about identifying new delivery models and dropping those non-traditional ways to help add value and mobilize internal audit teams accordingly. Of course, change of mindset is key. We can't keep doing things the same way. We can't keep doing things the same way. And I think for us as PwC, I think we went into the lockdown a week before government announced. That was a week before 18th of March, before government announced the initial lockdown. But what we're doing was we're testing whether we can actually work offsite and everything is business as usual. So we've been working, and up to now we've been working all through. So, but again, when it comes back to change of mindset, we do have quite a bit of, say, from the baby boomers, generation Y, X, and Z. So without that change of mindset in as regards, okay, how do you deploy your people? What are sort of those better working methods? What will apply for the generation Z? What might not apply for generation Y? How do we use technology in how we work? And how do we focus on efficiency and results? Of course, as we do all this, we need to prioritize relevance, speed, and flexibility. So again, Doreen mentioned agility in terms of how we do our work as audit. Whatever we talk about now should be relevant to the business in terms of how we do the work and produce results. We need to be very efficient, and we need to be flexible in as regards meeting the challenges the business is also being faced with. Encourage, of course, new ways of working, leverage new technology and data analytics. And with this, as we look at our plans, or as we look at our programs, can we go back and ask ourselves, okay, how can we do this better? Do we really have to go on site to review, say, like Doreen gave an example of cash and stuff? How can we review this particular area, or how do we review the key risks that the business is being exposed to now without actually being on site? And how do we work with management to create those sorts of avenues? Yeah. Of course, real-time assurance is really required as we speak. The business of post-mortem auditing is no longer working anymore. The business of consulting and giving insights and anticipating what's coming is where the internal audit practice is going. And that's what the management needs from us right now as we speak. The business of saying, oh, this happened and stuff, it won't really help anyone. It's about being anticipatory, it's about being proactive, it's about really looking at where you're going, what might happen, and being able to give assurance around the resilience or giving insights around what management needs to be thinking about. Of course, assisting other lines of defense. And by this, we've talked about compliance through engaging regulators or other statutory bodies. It could be with risk management, where you sit in there and look at how they're going about the risk assessment and updating of the business risk profile. And I think this is a very, 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 very pertinent area, because, you know, there's all sorts of, the risk profiles have totally changed for all businesses. Yeah. So how do you validate, how do you even understand management's view of risk? And how do you give your input at that point in time so that you can actually rely on whatever that assessments are coming out of risk? So again, looking at, if we look at what your colleagues have done across the world, 23% have been more proactive in reviews and advisory projects. So the post-mortem audits have been put to bed. We've seen, again, most of them are soliciting more stakeholder input and feedback. So as opposed to saying, okay, probably this is our view, they are reaching out to management and saying, okay, from your perspective, what are those things keeping you awake at night? How can we help? How can we deploy our resources better? And of course, there's some who are saying they've not changed, it's business as usual for them. But again, there are question marks around the sustainability of such approaches. But I think what comes out clearly from this slide is, you know, quite a bit of your colleagues across the world have moved into use of data analytics and virtual collaboration tools to deliver audits. So most of the audits are now being data-driven. So again, this poses the question around, how are you thinking through the different spheres or areas of audit within the audit universe or within the organization's risk profile? And how are you going about collecting pertinent data that will help you audit or provide assurance around all those sorts of processes? So what's coming out clearly from this slide is you need to upskill. You need to upskill. You need to engage probably the audit committee to give you some sort of budget to be able to upskill significantly and for you to be able to move towards providing more real-time assurance sort of work as opposed to post-mortem sort of reviews. Communication and collaboration, very key with all our key stakeholders. Who are your key stakeholders as internal audit? It starts with your staff. So how many of us as internal audit heads have actually reached out to your internal audit team to find out how they're doing, to confirm if they're safe, to confirm that all is well for them, or have you just been calling them to find out whether they're done with a particular project? Empathy starts here. It starts with the guys that you walk with through those corridors in a day-to-day. So as a leader, you'd want to find out how your team is doing, check up on them. You know, you can use any of the channels that we have. So, and then after you've done that, they'll have that appreciation of, okay, we have a leader that cares. But over and above that, ensure there is that sort of regular communication, because like I said, there's a lot of fear and anxiety in terms of job security, in terms of the near future. You have quite a bit of probably people that have started applying for jobs left, right, and center. So you need to give them the confidence that, you know what, we're here to stay. These are the plans that are in place. As a chief audit executive, you'll definitely be sitting part of the crisis response team. You'll definitely be discussing quite a number of plans with the CEO and the CFO. You need to give confidence to your team that you're here to stay and you're here to give value to the business. You need to be very transparent while doing that, because if you pose any sort of positions with your team or your key stakeholders, and then they later on get to find out that probably the position was an adverse sort of position. It was different from what you shared with them. You lose trust, and the moment you lose trust, you know, that sort of delegative responsibility is lost. When it comes to sharing emerging risks and validation of the same, you need to have those discussions with the audit committee. First and foremost, each internal audit function has a mission and a vision. So you need to discuss that in the perspective of the COVID pandemic and revalidate your focus area and revalidate what sort of role and responsibility internal audit is going to have in this pandemic, in this new normal, and have that discussion with the board audit committee chair to revalidate that. And thereafter, of course, have a discussion on what's really going to keep the business afloat and what are those emerging risks. After analyzing the business as usual and the new normal, what are those emerging risks that the business needs to focus on, and how do you plan to respond to that as internal audit? The same, of course, has to happen with your regulators, with your customers, with your staff within your businesses, with management, definitely, for them to get the buy-in, and then after you can update your plans and go ahead to execute. But I think the key point I need to give here is what worked yesterday does not work today when it comes to risk. You need to keep revalidating your risk assessments and reconfirming with the key stakeholders that things are working well. Then, of course, you need to communicate the new projects and new approaches to doing work, because what management knows today is different from what will happen tomorrow. So you need to keep in constant communication with your key stakeholders and as such, advise them of any new projects or approaches you're going to apply. So when we did also a review of your chief audit executives and asked them, okay, what's the top of the mind for the management team, you will see that quite a number of them are still saying that the impact of COVID to the business is actually what's keeping the management team awake at night. So how are we as internal auditors helping in that sort of discussion? And again, emerging risks impacting the company, same thing coming up here. So as we sit in these crisis response committees or as we engage the different stakeholders, how are we answering these sorts of questions, and what sort of solutions are we putting on the table to help them navigate the sort of concerns they have? But then again, how are we changing the internal audit plan to be as reflective of what's happening in the business? And then how do we maintain that focus on risk priorities and regulatory requirements? Because if you don't comply to what the regulator requires or what statutory bodies require, you might lose your license. So how are we tweaking our approach as internal audits to address some of these key concerns within the business with minimal, of course, disruption, to the business operations, and with minimal disruption within the internal audit team? Then again, another key topic around what's really keeping the board audit committee awake. Again, quite a number of them are saying the board is concerned with the impact on the business and how the emerging risks are impacting the company, and of course, how the audit plan is addressing those changes. So these are some of the messages that we need to be thinking about as internal auditors and planning around to make sure that we're engaging board or management and giving them our thoughts in terms of what might impact the business, what sort of emerging risks lie therein, and how we're updating our plan to address all that. Then, of course, we need to redirect any short-term excess capacity or resources to be able to consider the short-term support of the business. I think Doreen alluded to this, where some of the staff have been sent to some of these business units, whether it's within the first line or second line of defense. But I think, again, here it's about also how we can improve the department. There's been quite a bit of downtime. So don't say that we can't do anything as we speak. What sort of training can you hold using all these virtual collaboration tools we have? Then this is also a time for you to rethink, your risk assessment and your methodology for the internal audit, and also to have that sort of deep dive and discussion as internal audit, having looked at business as usual and the new normal. What sort of risks are coming out of that? How should we change our approach in terms of how we're performing the reviews? In terms of supporting the business, of course, we've already looked at compliance tracking. There's quite a bit of things that are coming through the Health and Safety, Environment, Employment Act, reprioritization of spending, because as the CFO is trying to grapple with finance and liquidity and stuff, how does that then speak to the contingency plan from a liquidity perspective? How does that then speak to the activities that are business critical? And what sort of input can you give as internal audit, having had a look at the entire organization's sort of operations and CapEx and OpEx budgets together with the strategy? Then have we as internal audit as well also taken that sort of reflection on ourselves to understand which areas where we might require support, and as such reached out? For instance, we're talking about all these cyber risks and all that kind of stuff. Do we have that capability internally? Can we then, if we don't, do we have the opportunity to have a discussion with the audit committee to identify this as a major risk or as an emerging risk, and as such seek for increasing the sort of capabilities or accessing the sort of capabilities that can help us from a cybersecurity perspective? Then again, when we look at what of some of your colleagues have done globally, of course, they've deployed team members to other areas, and this stems from the fact that they've performed those self-assessments and they understand the sort of capabilities within their teams. For instance, finance to deal with liquidity and to be able to come up with a robust sort of liquidity contingency plan, they could use some skills of your data analysts to be able to scan what sort of costs that the business has been incurring in the past, and be able to forecast what might be coming up, and be able to pull out those that come out on the operations that are going to be business critical. Then, of course, some of them have said they've added new internal audit projects, and as such had to defer work that was already planned in their FY20 projects. And of course, there's been also strategic transformations of the internal audit function to refocus their efforts, to refocus their capabilities, to refocus their mindset as well. There have been methodology transformations as well to be able to address the emerging risks, automation and digitization of work streams. And this is more or less focused on ability to work remotely, and also digital upskilling and training. So in a nutshell, I think it comes back to those 4 particular areas in terms of how do we as internal auditors confirm that we've redirected our risk expertise well to focus on the COVID priorities. How have we identified those new delivery channels, and what sort of non-traditional ways have we left and probably look towards mobilizing internal audit teams more appropriately? How have we communicated with our stakeholders? Can we as of today confirm that all our stakeholders, we understand their needs, and as such, we're in constant communication with them to try and advise them on how we plan to address those needs through our internal audit plan? And then how are we redirecting any excess capacity within the resources we have? So from our perspective as PwC, those are the 4 areas as internal auditors that we need to think about as of today. We need to work on as of today to be able to provide the support that is required within the business. So from a resources perspective, we do have quite a bit of insights available for you. So I talked about the COVID-19 survey about what business leaders should know. You can access that off the PwC site. These are the four ways of internal audit the 4 ways internal audit is responding to COVID-19. I've just taken you through some of those. You can access those off the PwC website. There's also the CFO Pulse survey that more or less focused on the challenges within the remit of the CFOs, and the results of those insights are also available on the PwC website. And then the broader sort of survey from a COVID-19 navigator perspective that is more or less assessing how different business leaders are dealing with challenges on a day-to-day basis, and what sort of things they're putting in place to help them navigate through this new normal. I think for now, we've come to the end of my presentation. And as I part with you today, I'd want to really communicate more to your mindsets. You know, we're dealing with a totally new normal, and as internal auditors, we should be at the forefront of discussing a change in mindset, in the way we do work. For instance, I think yesterday I was discussing with the moderator, Doreen, about what this then means for businesses from a perspective of the human capital. You know, do you need to hold on to all the staff you have, or can you hire some staff on a part-time basis and really define key result areas for them, so that even if you know, they are to come in for 2 hours or 3 hours, those 3 hours are actually result-oriented hours, as opposed to someone sitting through the entire day at a particular premise? Do we have to, do businesses have to cling on to all that space in terms of the business premises, or can actually some people work offsite? I've always been challenging bankers, because we've seen the likes of people in customer service working offsite. You know, they have secure laptops, they have a secure line, they have access to the bank's applications, and all they do is they're receiving calls and are actually helping customers out. So do all these salespeople or customer service people have to trek into the bank? So how can we help the business optimize its operations, re-engineer its processes, and maximize efficiency? I think those are the key things as internal auditors we should be thinking about today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adam. And once again, thank you very much, CPA Doreen, for the presentation that you have made. The feedback coming from the members is that they're very happy with the presentations that you have made, and we are very spot on. So we will now take some questions. I see a number of questions on the chat board, so I'll read them out. CPA Doreen and CPA Adam, kindly take note. So the first one is from Fahad. He says, as internal auditors, what are the organization risks that can result from suspension and termination of employee contracts? And how can organizations overcome this risk due to financial difficulties? And then Amos wants to know what has been the involvement of the internal audit function in the emergency purchases due to COVID-19, which were not originally planned for in institutional budgets. And CPA Wilbur asks, how do you assess the potential of fraud now that evidently people are stressed financially with great uncertainty, and how should internal audits ready themselves to handle this?
CPA Doreen, I think we're going to forget the questions if you read all of them.
No, just taking them in batches of 5.
Ah, okay.
I'm reading them in batches of 5, and then you will take them at that. Ivan says, as Doreen has stressed out that we have to adopt the new normal, can you offer guidance on the critical success factors and key performance indicators which stakeholders need to align to achieve the strategic objectives and vision of the company post-COVID? And the 5th one is from CPA Stephen. He says, management has not yet set up new processes documented, but goes ahead to override the controls. What should internal audit do in the COVID-19 situation? So let's take those 5, and if time allows, we'll pick another set of 5. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take the first one, CPA Doreen, around employee contracts. As internal, you know, we are going through a period where a lot of organizations are struggling, and some of them have started to take decisions to terminate employee contracts. So I think if you actually look at the situation, this is happening globally. It's not just in Uganda. And one of the key things that comes through is legal risk. And of course, people risk when it comes to which kind of people are you terminating the contracts. Are they vulnerable people, expectant mothers and well people, you didn't look after them and things like that. So that risk does exist. And from a standpoint, how an organization can make sure that they basically manage that risk as they're going through these processes, because these are not things that you can stop as internal audit. The ability for an organization to make a decision on whether to keep or not keep employees depends on the sustainability of the business. But from an internal audit perspective is to make sure that as they think about such things, one, have they got legal input and support around that? So you need to be involved and also understand the decision-making process, the input from consultants, from compliance and legal, and that is where your input can come in. I don't think that in terms of managing that risk is audit giving advice on whether it can go ahead or not, but giving advice on the process that is followed and making sure that all the consultants that need to be part of it are part of it. I hope that answers the question. And report to the audit committee on that.
Thank you, Doreen.
Okay, from my side, I think I'll just have comments on a couple of questions that have been raised. And I'd want to start with, how do you assess the potential of fraud, as internal audit? In my presentation, I talked about the changes to the control environment arising from activation of the BCP arrangement. And as such, as internal audit, the first thing we ought to do is be able to map key processes, controls under the business as usual scenario, which I bet we have, and then be able to also assess the impact of the potential changes in these controls or in these processes, because as of now, we are operating under BCP mode. The processes are not operating as business as usual. So you need to look at the original process flow maps and look at what are those activities within those processes that are now operational, and be able to identify what sort of activities within those processes are being sort of like jumped or being made redundant. And as such, articulate, within the internal audit team, use this downtown to articulate what sort of risks are emerging out of that. And again, this is not away from the pressures we have, because you very well know how your staff are doing. You know which people have been laid off, or which people have been asked to take half pay. You know which people are totally under that sort of financial pressure in as regards meeting their day-to-day obligations. So for example, you could consider impact of changes to management roles and structures on delegations of authority, changes to system access and change controls to enable flexible work environments due to the pandemic, and then those probably incompatible combination of access rights. I know from reviews we do as PwC, for instance, in SAP environments, all these other ERPs, you can actually create these scripts that will give you those sorts of combinations of access rights that will give someone input, review, and approval sort of rights. And then you ask the compliance team to be able to monitor those transactions on an ongoing basis to be able to make sure that the business is not being exposed. Then, of course, you'll also focus on unavailability or changed operations of physical controls. For instance, there's things like hard copy signatures that are no longer being required for documents as part of review of approval. And of course, that also renders loss of direct management oversight. So how are you monitoring those sorts of processes that we're relying on hard copy forms to make sure that there's optimal review and approval? Then going back to the BCP arrangements, how have we critically analyzed the BCP plans for weaknesses and identified impacts to specific COVID areas? And how has this then again exposed us to third parties in as regards how are third parties as such be able to to go through with different fraudulent schemes in as regards in terms of how the business is operating with them. So from a fraud perspective, again, how many of us have actually thought about the ethics hotline or the whistleblowing hotline to try and find out what's going on there? Has the business actually communicated to staff and said, you know what, much as we're dealing with this, we still need to do business the right way. If you probably see something that doesn't add up, please report this, or please speak up. So how are we championing that process? Because again, most frauds are actually as a result of tip-offs. So how are we effective in picking those tip-offs, in making sure those ethics and hotlines are working well, in making sure that the staff have confidence in those lines, and as such, whatever the report will actually be investigated, and their probably identities will be protected. So from a fraud risk perspective, those are some of the options you could use. There's someone that asked a question around the critical success factors in terms of post-COVID. I think for me, it's okay. Before I address the critical success factors, probably just another thing I need to add from a fraud risk perspective. How often or how well have we utilized data analytics to be able to apply some sort of behavioral analytics? I know for banks, there's certain things we used to do in the past when I was still there. Things like failed access or access to particular accounts and stuff, and probably there are hits that come out of someone trying to more or less, if you might call it, forge someone's password and all kind of stuff. There's some sort of hits you can monitor to probably have an indication of what someone might be trying to do. So how has internal audit considered use of data analytics or some tools in use to look for these indicators and investigate them in real time? Because if you look at someone's login history, and whenever they log in, they're trying to access a particular account, or they're trying to do something, but they probably are not getting through. But of course, as they try, all these hits are being picked up. Then additionally, as long-term staff are forced to work from home and change their normal routine, this might also uncover long-running fraud practices. So as people are working remotely and not within the business, so what has changed? What sort of challenges is the business facing now? And they're probably alluding to someone not being there and all kind of stuff. So those are sort of some of the things you could be looking at to uncover fraud or to uncover some malpractices. So going into the critical success factors, I think, okay, I'll probably share what has worked at PwC. I think from leadership perspective, leadership is key. You need to first of all empathize with your staff in terms of what they're going through, and of course, beyond empathy is now the area around discussing and being transparent and being candid. Because if you're struggling as a business, how have you engaged your staff to actually tell them what the business is dealing with and actually involve them in discussion of what the options might be? And I would say, as opposed to saying that I'm laying off staff and I have to lay you off, probably that would be the worst case scenario. But by the time I get to that sort of decision, I ought to have engaged with different groups of staff at different levels and probably discuss the sort of challenges we're facing. You'll be surprised how many staff can actually come up and volunteer to help out in all sorts of things. It could be collections, for instance. Yeah, you could be running a business that has that probably sells out quite a bit of things on credit, and your collections team doesn't have the ample capacity to help out on that. But if you engage your staff and tell them, we're dealing with all sorts of issues when it comes to collections or receivables, some of those people could actually volunteer to help out, follow up with your suppliers, help out, do what needs to be done, or even volunteer ideas in terms of how you could handle some of these things. So for me, I think you need to have the confidence in terms of you need to build the trust first with your staff, for them to know that you're in this together, yeah? and then thereafter involve them along the way in terms of how do we actually address this? The business is ours, it's mine, it's yours. How do we address this challenge? As PwC, yes, we've gone through the COVID pandemic, but it's been not business unusual. It's been more or less business as usual for us. We've continued to work. We've continued to ensure engagements get done. We've continued to engage clients, advise them on how they can prioritize in terms of liquidity and working capital management. We've continued to collect and we've continued to pay staff. But that all started with the discussion around being empathetic to staff, being very transparent with them, being very candid on what sort of issues we're dealing with as a business, and then thereafter winning their sort of support and confidence in us in as regards supporting the business get through this. For instance, some other example I could easily share. You've had staff that have been redundant all this time, but quite of them probably are not willing to even charge their leave. Yeah, so have we articulated the financial impact of leave not taken during this period on the business and shown staff that, well, is it an option of you hanging on to your leave, or is it an option of you actually getting your salary? You know, which is better? Which is better for me and you? Which is better for the business? So as you engage staff, you know, you'll be surprised how they can easily understand what sort of situation the business is dealing with and what sort of insights or things can come through them volunteering. If it's advice on what we can do as a business, if it's things they actually also commit to sacrifice. And at the end of the day, when you come back to the new normal, when you come back to the days of working again, you know, you have a team that's together, that's well engaged, that has the trust in where the business is going. And of course, like they say, the rest is history. So I think there was also a question around management not setting up the new processes, but goes ahead to override the controls. Probably, Doreen, if you may just read the question again, so that I'm confident that my answer will probably address it.
All right, thank you so much, Adam and Doreen. We will take another set of 5, and if time allows, we'll pick another set. So someone is asking, how can we advise management to get out of the fear of remote working insecurity? They assume there is a lot of insecurity, and this has greatly affected work. And then CPA David Sande Kayanja asks, how does internal audit continue to deliver its ongoing assurance without disrupting critical operations, areas at this time of crisis? And then Adila wants to know, how can internal auditors be of utmost use during these unprecedented times without compromising independence and objectivity? And then we have CPA Kili. He says, how can an internal auditor be relevant in this crisis in relation to an NGO setting? And then we have CPA Edward. How can businesses assure themselves of third-party preparedness to support them continue business during a pandemic? So in no particular order of who answers what, let's take those 5, and if time allows, we'll pick another 5. Thank you.
Thank you, Doreen. I'll take up a couple of them, and then I'll hand over to CPA Adam. I think the one that I'll talk about first is on the independence, how we can continue to advise business and do what we need to do without compromising our independence. There are several ways which we can do this. So I think the situation that we are in now, we cannot say we will be too independent, otherwise we'll start to lose the value. But how we start to then think about how we can maintain that, there are things that I can share that as teams you can take away and consider. So One, if you look at the advisory piece, if you're looking at a piece of work, give the advice, but don't be part of the implementer. And if you're giving the advice, but you're not part of the implementation, the chances of you getting compromised are actually less, because then the onus is on management to either take your advice or not. But that advice usually becomes very relevant, especially in this situation. So keep up to date with best practice, understand your business, and give advice where necessary, and document this advice very clearly to show what particular area, what risks you're looking at, and that should also then be a part of where we can actually provide assurance during this period. Then other ways you can do is probably look at separating teams. So I've seen organizations that split the people who are involved in advisory work, so that it's very clear that this piece of work is an advisory piece of work. And so the people that then get involved in the advisory don't get involved in auditing the area in the near future. And that means you can even then consider, if you're going to do an advisory on an area, maybe you can push the audit. You don't have to do the audit during that particular period as well. Push it to the next year, so that by the time you come to do the audit, the business is owning that particular area. So there are several ways, and providing advisory and being part of the different discussions now will not necessarily impair our independence, and we should keep that in top of mind. I just also then will talk about briefly how I think someone asked a question on how we can continue to do what and do our audits, do our work without having significant impact and disrupting the businesses. If you actually look at the conversation today, it's how do we do that? This is the question. How do we remain relevant? How do we do our work without necessarily being seen as disruptors or significantly impacting the business? So the part about, I'll just go back to some of the things I talked about in my presentation. The part about our processes, how we can relook at our processes to enable that. The part about how we can become business enablers, and I'll talk to a few pointers there. If you actually are part of a conversation, if you're part of a response team, you're part of the conversation in crisis management committee, the chance that you will be seen as a disruptor start to reduce if you come in at the right time. So give the feedback real time, give the feedback in the emergency meetings. Don't wait for the meetings to happen. Get a pack, review it, and then give the feedback after a week. People have moved on. You're then holding people, asking questions, so you start to look at it as a disruptor. So how do we look at our involvement and providing real-time feedback so that we are not seen as disruptors? There are things that we need to look at in terms of our processes, remote working, the tools that can enable us to do this better, like, if you're using Teams or Skype, how do you record conversations so that when you have a meeting, you don't necessarily start following up with questions, what did you say, record your conversations and listen to them. So look at your processes, look at how you've been doing your work and the technology that you have and how it can make you less disruptive. One key one that I'd also talked about is data. The conversation around data analysis, the conversation around data science is going to be very critical in terms of how we can do our work and be less disruptive. If you look at organizations now that are moving into digitization, that are moving into automating processes, the less you actually sit and ask for someone to open a file and turn pages, the less that you have to keep asking someone to extract a report and show you what they're doing, the more you're able to do this yourself, the more you're able to understand the flow of systems, the more you're able to understand how you can respond and give assurance over risks without necessarily making it a manual process. I think the less disruptive internal audit profession will be. And if I actually, I think there was a question around digitization and how we look at it. If you look at the current construct of our industry, our economy, where people are moving into that, the audit way of doing things now will become irrelevant if we continue doing it manually. Because as the business automates, we need to automate our audit processes. If you're going out, and I'll use the banking industry again, if, for example, when we used to audit branches, you go to a branch and one of the key risks you're looking at was whether a payment of cash was authorized. So you get, people used to fill in vouchers. You get a voucher, you look at signatures, sometimes even have to get an expert to understand the signature, but they threw away the vouchers. They're no longer using the vouchers. They're using digital signatures, they're using the system. So you cannot provide assurance over authorization of a payment by trying to do it manually. One, you will spend a whole lot of time trying to get someone to extract each and every payment that you sample and explain to you who authorized it. We should then have changed, at this point in time, should be thinking about how do we then start to automate a process where we understand the configuration of the systems, we understand the data, we understand how those systems pick up who has authorized the payment, we analyze the data from a backend, and you bring the findings. Those are the things that will make us disruptive. So guys, data, our processes, and how we become real-time feedback providers are the things that will make us less disruptive and valuable. I'll ask maybe Adam to answer the other questions, because I think I've covered it.
Okay, thanks, Doreen. I'll start with the remote working challenge, and I think this has always been a challenge for everyone. What I'll probably say as probably internal audit or business leaders, we need to first understand who needs to buy in from a perspective of embracing remote working and what they would consider critical for them to buy in embracing remote working. When we understand those two elements, if we understand who needs to buy in and what they will consider critical, then we'll take a step back to make sure that, okay, if I ask myself, as a chief audit executive, what would I really consider key in terms of being able to embrace this remote working capability or work style? And then I have to think through that before I even approach my head of audit. Then I'll definitely have some issues to consider before I go in to try and have a discussion with my head of audit. What's critical here is we need to move away from the business as usual setting. You get up in the morning, you sit in jam for 2 hours, you get to work. When you just get to work, remember you probably dropped kids, you didn't have tea at home. The first thing you do is take tea at work, then you go through newspapers, then before you know it, it's 10, then you're going into a meeting. There's a lot of time that has been wasted there, as opposed to if I got up at home at 6 or 7 and I have my laptop there and I'm going to log in, because we have all these virtual tools. For instance, if I may give an example, at PwC, we have all Hangouts supported by Google. We're already on Google. So I'll be sitting like this in a meeting, engaging people, going through any discussions we need to have, without necessarily losing the time and the focus through driving 2-3 hours through jam. Then of course you lose the same time in the evening. That's already a cost to the business. So if I can articulate it from the point of view, and I remember Doreen alluded to it, that as auditors, we already have what they call timesheets. My time is actually costed on an hourly basis. So if I lose 2 hours out of 8 hours in a day or 3 hours, it's at the end of the day, it's going to cost the business, because the business has to cover that overhead from a salary perspective. They'll compute how many hours I have in a month, and they'll have to pay me a salary. So if I can start linking the sort of like issues around areas that affect my productivity to the cost to the business, and that will then be able to have a very fruitful discussion if it's with the CFO or someone else who's focused on budget and figures and all that kind of stuff. Then we need to move towards a result-oriented approach. When you have a team, communicate what their tasks are, communicate what you need them to do, agree what sort of results you need, agree the timelines, yeah? Then I don't have to wonder where you are, why you're not in office, or all that kind of stuff. We've agreed the action plan, we've agreed what needs to be done, we agreed what the results are. We've agreed that I'll have progress updates with you, just like we're doing here. you know, using virtual collaboration tools, I'll check up on you. You'll give me an update on a daily basis. This is where I am. We have the files. As internal auditors, we have all these tools that we use. It could be Teammate or all the others that are in the market. You know, you can easily see a file. You can see progress in terms of what people have done. So there is totally no need for someone to be in your face. As we speak, just this week, I was looking at assignments in Zambia and Mauritius. So, you know, I'm not in Mauritius, I'm not in Zambia, but I'm looking at things in Uganda, things that are happening in Mauritius, things that are happening in Zambia. That's the new normal. That's where we should be as auditors. So again, I think what's key is let's define, the sort of actions we need from our staff. Let's be very granular when it comes to accountability of time. If you've come today in office and you've sat in office, you know, sometimes you wonder, some people come in office at 6 and leave at 7, but if you actually sit down and ask them, what have you done today? You know, they will probably not be able to put a point to something and say, this is what I've accomplished. Whereas if the discussion is around, these are your tasks for probably this week or next week, these are the deliverables, or this is what I require from you, this is how much time it's going to take, please let me know around, let's do a catch up 2-3 days down the road and see how far you are. That's a more fruitful discussion to have. So I'm not going to look around for you. And as such, I think that will help us change our mindset, especially if we're dealing with the Generation Z. Generation Z people can even work from cafe Javas. You know, they'll work from anywhere. They'll work with music on and headphones. You know, when it comes to baby boomers, when you have headphones on, you know, the baby boomer will think that probably you're not focused, you know, whereas the Generation Z people can deal with all sorts of, can manage distraction and still be very focused in what they're doing. So key point there in remote working, understand who needs to buy, understand what sort of information they will consider critical to buy in, but also define the sort of actions you need from the staff in terms of deliverables, in terms of results, push your staff to account for time, identify the cost savings the organization can make out of remote working. How can we deliver without disruption? I think disruption is if we continue cracking the whip. For instance, you're part of the crisis response team and you're talking about the things Doreen was referring to. Oh, this BCP is not compliant. Oh, this step has been missed. You know, there you're totally disrupting. You know, if we're able to understand that, you know, these are uncertain times, if we're able then to look at, okay, happen, given all these things that are going on, what's going to happen? If I'm a CEO and the chief audit executive comes to me and discusses with me, gives me a comparison of business as usual process flows, what's happening currently, what are the potential areas I'm going to, that might have caused probably fraudulent risk exposures, or any sort of other risk exposures to the business, and how internal audit plans to support us in terms of monitoring or creating, giving me assurance around those areas. That's a fruitful discussion to have, not a discussion around, oh, we still have to audit this area, or these guys are not giving us documents. So at the end of the day, how are you supporting critical activities? You know, how have you really embraced the new normal, and how are you speaking in terms of relevance? How are you speaking to the business? What is business critical today? What's keeping the CFOs and business leaders awake today? You know, is it a discussion on how we can better optimize our liquidity position, or how we can manage our workforce, or how we can, for instance, we talked about return to work. You know, everyone is up in arms, oh, next week we're going to work. But you know what? You know, at the end of the day, 4-meter social distancing. You know, what plans do businesses have around that? How are they managing staff and anxiety? So those are, you need to come with solutions as opposed to, you know, cracking the whip and pushing the backward down onto management. So I think for me, it's a change in our focus as internal audit that will help us deliver without disruption per se. Relevance in terms of an NGO, there is someone that asked a question around that. Normally manage fiduciary risks on behalf of donors, on behalf of government, and of course manage through sub-recipients and grantees or some beneficiaries. So as an internal auditor, you need to build the confidence of your donor, because the donor is being concerned as we speak that they've sent money to you. It could probably be misappropriated. It probably is not reaching the last mile and all that kind of stuff. So how have you gone about your stakeholder management assessment in order to just be able to articulate the needs of the stakeholders like donors, to articulate the government is currently dealing with, and how you can support a non-governmental organization perspective, and then thereafter also engaging beneficiaries to make sure you're not losing touch with your core missions and visions as an NGO. I think briefly that's what I can comment about that. I'd want to also talk about the third parties, Adam? Right? The last one, third parties, if I may. Cool. Now, third parties, twofold. There is supply chain, yeah, the guys you're relying on, and other guys that are supporting you in other sort of like services. Of course, first and foremost, when parties assess risks associated with outsourced arrangements and the robustness of third-party controls. That's a key area that internal audit sometimes is not focused on in the normal business as usual. So how well do you know the risks that are associated with that third-party arrangements, and how robust are those controls? You know, when it comes to, if say your first in line third party fails to deliver on something, what is the fallback position? Then where is the organization significantly dependent on third parties to deliver core services? You know, then consider a fit for purpose sort of assurance program over those key risks and controls associated with delivery of services by a third party. When it comes to the supply chain as well, right from sourcing of raw and distributing more or less products to clients, you need to have a deep understanding of the organization's entire supply chain and those risks that are being presented by those third parties, and then understand more or less and prepare through assessing the critical supply chain data across all those tiers, and then properly assessing the potential risks and opportunities to enable the business to take advantage where need be. And where applicable, you need to prepare and set up a temporary, more or less, inventory recovery and evaluation process to pursue alternative sourcing strategies. So as internal audit, you can't afford to sit back from that perspective of helping the business manage the third party sort of risk. Even as we go forward, this needs to be your top priority in terms of the assurance work you're performing on the firm's business continuity plans or business continuity management strategies. Thank you.
A very big thank you to CPA Adam and CPA Doreen Rakatongo. We appreciate that you have shared very insightful thoughts, and I believe everyone that has participated in this webinar has actually benefited. Our time is up, and unfortunately we can't take any further questions. The presentations will be shared. The comments around abbreviations and other things will be dealt with before we share the presentations. And I want to say thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you so much to Secretariat. I want to wish you a lovely evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Stay home, stay safe, stay risk intelligent, and have a lovely weekend.
Yeah, interesting. Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Take care.